G'day YouTube, welcome back to the channel. It's been a while since I made a video. I've taken a bit of a break over the summertime. The kids were off school. The weather has been very hot, which makes it difficult to disappear out into the workshop and spend the time I need to make these videos. The weather's cooling off a bit, the kids are back at school, so I'm trying to set aside a little bit more time for RC projects. Today we're going to be talking about the MEUS Racing MB24. Now, I know that that's not a new platform for the FCX24, it's one that's been out for quite a while, but I wanted to do something different. If you've ever seen any videos online of the real 21 Ford Bronco Funhaver Ultra 4 race vehicle, that vehicle that this is based on is just absolutely incredible. It can blast across the desert at speeds that is usually only reserved for desert racing vehicles, and when it hits the rocks and the steep terrain, it can also crawl incredibly well. So that was something I wanted to explore with this build. I wanted to mimic that performance as close as possible. The way that I went about getting that high-speed performance while still retaining some low-down crawlability was, rather than base this build off an FCX24, I went ahead and based it on the FMS FCX24m. Now, you guys are probably all pretty familiar with this vehicle by now. We know that this vehicle runs ring and pinion axles and a 2-speed transmission, just like its bigger brother, the FCX24. And the chassis rails on this thing are nearly a carbon copy of the SCX24, which means we can take the running gear out of the Camel Trophy vehicles and use it to build up chassis and bodies that are intended and designed around the SCX24 platform. So that's kind of a game changer. FMS has really done us a big favor by having so much cross compatibility with the SCX24. It means that we can create things out of these little 24 scale vehicles that we weren't able to before. This is actually a really simple build. For the most part, I've just taken the running gear directly from the Range Rover and swapped it straight over to this MB24. All of the link lengths are all stock from the Range Rover there. The wheelbase is identical. The only real changes I've made are to make sure that this thing has enough speed to do all of that high speed jumping and bashing and all that fun sort of stuff. And the rest of the mods are mainly to make sure that the suspension can handle that and it doesn't break every time you drive it. The most important modification that I've done to this vehicle is installed a brushless motor. Now, this is probably the most controversial SCX24 brushless motor. It's the Spectrum Firma brushless that was originally engineered for the SCX24. The speed controller that was shipped with that really let the motor down and didn't allow it to shine, and basically for Spectrum it was a huge flop. No one likes this motor because of that and nobody really buys it. I picked one up and tested it out in an SCX24 running the dinky D-Drive Micro Sport, which I'm using here again, and I really like the results. It's lightweight, it's a 4500 kV, so it has tons of top end speed, and as it turns out, it bolts directly to this FCX24m transmission. The only thing you need to do is pop the pinion off that comes installed on the motor, and there's an optional 11-tooth pinion in the package when you buy the motor, and that's what I've used to install it in here. It bolts straight onto the transmission and it works absolutely perfectly. With the 2-speed, you get a nice combination of low-end crawlability and then pop it into second, and this thing is absolutely really fast. It can pop wheelies, it can do jumps. It's actually quite impressive in this application. Now, it's not a torque monster. It's not going to do well in heavy vehicles. This thing weighs about 370 grams all up, ready to run with the battery installed, and in this application it doesn't do too badly at all. With the power system sorted out, the first weakness was quickly exposed when I was running this vehicle doing some high-speed test runs, and I crashed it into an immovable object and killed the stock FMS servo. Absolutely no fault of FMS's. The speed that this thing is capable of is pretty incredible, and we're pushing all of this rock crawling hardware to the absolute limits. But the problem that I did find was that I wasn't able to fit an upgraded servo on this axle. The mount is too tight and everything I had on hand was just too wide to fit onto that stock plastic mount. So the compromise that I came up with was to use one of these stock axial AS1 servos, It's just a plastic gear servo. It's pretty basic. It's not really torquey enough out on the rocks, but it does get the job done, and it does have a built-in servo saver. I ended up modifying the stock servo saver to soften it up a bit to make sure that this servo could survive a ton of abuse, huge jumps, high-speed cartwheels, and that sort of thing. And I won't go into the full details of how I modified that. If there's enough interest, leave a comment down below. I may do a separate video on the modifications I did internally to that servo saver. But so far this has been holding up pretty good. Like I said, it's a huge compromise. It's not ideal out on the rocks, but it is getting the job done, and it's survived for several runs and several big crashes. The next modification I did was with the shocks. The stock FCX24m shocks are actually pretty good. However, they're quite a short stroke shock, and I wanted something with some longer travel to be able to land those bigger jumps and take those bigger hits. So after taking some measurements at ride height, I came up with these Next Racing 36mm SCX24 shocks. They're an oil shock, and they've actually been really holding up nicely. They haven't leaked, and they fit this application perfectly. To be able to get that longer stroke mounted to the vehicle without raising the center of gravity, keeping everything nice and low, I moved the lower shock mount down to share the same bolt as the lower link here, and that's worked out really nicely. It's allowed me to get that long stroke shock in there without lifting the vehicle up and making it unstable, so that I could run bigger tires and get a bit more stability out of the vehicle. I ended up using some wider SCX24 hexes. These are just a generic brass hex for the SCX24. I think they're a +5. They fit directly onto these axles, even though the pin in here is very slightly smaller diameter. It doesn't seem to be causing a problem. These have been holding up to an absolute ton of abuse. As long as you put Loctite on these extended bolts, everything seems to be holding up really nicely. For wheels and tires, the first thing I picked up with these new Proline Toyo Open Country tires. I felt like the look and the design was perfect for this race truck style build. The next thing I went and picked up were these titanium rings from MEUS Designs. Now these are the 16-hole rings, and he calls them the King of the Hammers design. Now I thought that was pretty appropriate for this build. I picked up the rings first, and the only Enduro wheels that I had that were compatible with them were these orange 16-hole wheels. Now the orange didn't really fit the build very well, so I went ahead and hit the wheels with some black spray paint so that the focus was on those titanium rings, and I'm pretty pleased with the results. I think they look really nice on the truck, and I think they're really appropriate for the style of build. The reason I chose these tires is I wanted something that rolls nice and smoothly at top speed. The tread design on these looked perfect for the application. I think it fits the desert racing vibe. These things roll incredibly smoothly at top speed. They seem to hook up pretty well on the rocks. The foams in them are just the stock Proline foams that come with the tires. The wheels are vented, no brass in any of the wheels to try to keep things as light as possible so that we can accelerate quickly and hit a high top speed. The squishiness of the tire and foam in that vented setup really helps to absorb bumps. It becomes part of the suspension system, and it really helps the vehicle take bigger hits, particularly when you're going fast and doing big jumps and things like that. When it comes to suspension links, I'm running the wheelbase, and all of the links are stock except for the rear lower links. Now the only reason I've upgraded those rear lower links is because I was coming down off a large step down jump, and I caught the back wheel, and it's pulled the axle backwards, and it was able to just split the end of the factory plastic link. So I was intending to just keep everything plastic and flexible, but I had to come up with a solution to replace that one broken link. Normally I keep these SCX24 rod ends to build my own links. I try to keep those on hand at all times. I normally use this brass tubing with 2mm threaded brass rod on the inside of it. I ended up changing to a carbon fiber rod of the same dimensions so that I can make homemade links and make them super nice and lightweight for this high-speed build. That pretty much rounds out the most important parts of the build. I don't think I mentioned what transmitter I'm running this thing on. I've got the Dinky D-Drive Microsport ESC. I'm using a D-cased Turbo Racing 4-channel receiver, and I'm running that all from the little Turbo Racing P32 transmitter. It's my favorite cheapy little transmitter. Channel 3, this little push button here is what is used to operate the transmission, and that leaves a spare open channel. As you can see, if you want the lights on, I just plug that in. Rather than having an LED light controller, extra wiring, extra weight, that just keeps things nice and simple. That's enough talking about the build. Let's get this thing outside and rip it around the driveway a little bit, take it out onto the rock course, try to give you a bit of an idea of what sort of performance to expect out of this setup. Starting off with a second gear launch downhill, hopefully you can see just how fast this little vehicle is. Handling around the corners can be a little bit challenging. You definitely have to back off and take it easy in the corners. It does have a tendency to traction roll if you try to feed in too much throttle, as you can see here. This vehicle really does like hoisting the front wheels in the air. It's an absolute ton of fun to do wheelies and jumps with. Then shifting down into first gear gets you a decent amount of low speed crawlability. Wheel speed in first gear is still pretty impressive, as you can see there. I gave it a little bit too much throttle. You do have to be careful with the amount of power that this thing has. Even on 2S it's pretty impressive. You might see throughout this clip the vehicle stutters and cogs a little bit when it's under load and in a bind. And that just comes down to this tiny little Spectrum Firma brushless motor not having a huge amount of torque down low. But I honestly think that the compromise is well worth it. Given how fun this vehicle is to drive, you can do some crawling like this and then put it in second gear and you've got a little high-speed basher that's an absolute ton of fun to drive. You can see as I maneuver the vehicle into position for this descent that I'm really struggling with the power produced by that stock axial AS1 servo. Obviously the stock servo saver not helping. Downhill control with this motor and speed control is excellent. You can see that really nice slow crawl that you're able to achieve, and that gives you excellent control on descents. Heading up this V-notch section of the course, you can see the sidewall lugs on these Toyo open country tyres doing a decent job. You might see a little bit more of that stuttering and cogging when the vehicle's under load, and it's really not that bad once you get used to it. You do need to feed in a little bit more throttle than what's expected in some binds, but with the nice low gearing of first gear, the little motor is able to get the job done. It just takes a little bit of practice to get smooth with it. I had to attempt this little climb here about 3 times. The lack of low down torque, the soft steering servo and servo saver really made this quite a challenging obstacle. After about 3 attempts I was able to get it done, but it was a lot of work. So that's some of the compromises, some of the downsides to this build, but I think it is pretty neat that it's able to go so fast and do really nice big jumps and still have some pretty decent control out on the rocks. Well, that pretty much wraps things up for today, guys. Hopefully this video was able to show you what sort of performance is possible out of the FMS FCX24m platform, especially combined with that Spectrum firmer 4500 kV brushless motor. It really does open up a whole new world of capabilities. It gives you the opportunity to build something completely different while still sticking with SCX24 sized vehicles. So if you enjoyed today's content, please consider subscribing to the channel if you haven't done so already. As always, guys, thank you so much for watching, and I'll catch you next time.